Last February, Texas suffered a disastrous ice storm that caused blackouts across the state for a number of days. And it's caused a lot of tongue wagging ever since, as the state comes to grips with what happened and how to prevent it in the future. So we're going to talk to Richard Zdunkewicz, who's the vice president of Wood Mackenzie America's consulting practice, about some ideas he has for ways to improve the ERCOT system. And welcome to the interview, Richard.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And by the way, I'll add that the white paper was a collaboration between Wood Mackenzie and our sister company, Power Advocate.
Excellent, and I'll put a link to the white paper in the description so that people can access it if they'd like. So, Richard, you mentioned a couple of issues around markets, moving to a capacity market, developing an integrated market model. Can you explain what you had in mind, please?
Well, sure. So, and this is not a recommendation. This was an idea that ERCOT should consider seriously, because ERCOT's the only market that does not have a capacity market feature, and it does serve a valuable role in market design and has seemed to work well for other markets. So it's something that should be looked at in the future by the policymakers and regulators. But if you want to briefly walk through the things that I spoke to, really it kind of starts for Texas with supply chain. So we've got a supply chain that is for power generation that's highly dependent upon natural gas, and so shoring up the supply of natural gas, making sure through some degree of weatherization, I think, is appropriate. With respect to market design, like we talked about with capacity market, should be considered, and that would take some of the experts within ERCOT and other places to analyze what it would take to institute that market design concept feature, and what it would take to integrate that over time. Not sure that you could really kind of flip a switch tomorrow and institute a capacity market here, but it's certainly something that should be looked at. And I'll point out that it's not a certainty. I talked about supply chain earlier. It's not a certainty that a capacity market in and of itself would have averted the problems that we had in February.
Maybe, Richard, you could explain the difference between an energy market and a capacity market.
Sure. So an energy market is basically paying a market participant for the power that they generate. And obviously, they've got to have the ability to generate that power. A capacity feature added to that market. So think of it as energy only and capacity and energy. Capacity basically through an auction process that's generally 1 to 3 years out in the future is going to award a market participant on the basis of capacity that's needed in excess of what is considered to be the peak demand out in the future. Okay, and so an ISO can model what they think peak demand is. They can put some reserve above that, and then the auction process is going to do what it does and go award that capacity, through a very through a non-opaque process, right? So that the market sees the results of that auction and awards the capacity accordingly. So it's a feature that supports generation in excess of historical peak demands, and gives an added measure of insurance and protection to that market in case some unusual things happen, right?
Right. My understanding is that ERCOT has been running with a 7% reserve, which I think the commentators I've seen is rather low. In fact, one said was the lowest in the country. So presumably this additional capacity would come online and then bump that reserve up.
Yeah, so reserves are going to be treated differently, but the interesting part of that is how are they defining their reserve capacity, right? Because there's different levels of certainty within that mix. So when PJM talks about their reserve and ERCOT talks about their reserve, they might be talking about slightly different things.
Okay, fair enough. Now, you also talked about incentivizing and integrating distributed energy resources. What did you have in mind there?
Yeah, so the concept is, and by the way, this is an active feature of really every market. There's distributed generation and increasingly battery storage in every market. But the concept is this, that technology for distributed resources, distributed generation, battery storage is getting more efficient, getting less expensive per kilowatt or megawatt of capacity. And so given the stress on transmission and distribution systems, that it makes sense to locate that generation or those resources closer. And resources can be generation, like I said, or storage, as I mentioned. It can also be demand response. So it can also be an industrial facility or maybe even some substantive commercial facility that is willing to curtail its use for power for some period of time. So, having distributed resources in the mix of total resources gives the ISO, gives ERCOT some flexibility in how they manage the grid and resources. And if the incentives are there, if the market mechanism's there, then those resources get awarded for dedicating capacity and actually taking the action to either provide generation and into the grid or to, like I said, curtail. So that can be a really important mix when there's not enough large-scale generation that's available. And it's an interesting tool, I think, for regulators, and it's an interesting concept for investors. And we see actually more investors these days interested in companies that are developing microgrids and what we call DER, distributed energy resources.
Now, the latest Texas legislative session just ended, and there was one bill emerge out of it, SB3. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so as we mentioned in the white paper, there were a number of bills that were being contemplated, and as it happens, these things get sort of consolidated into one bill. So Senate Bill 3 emerged. I'm not sure it's been signed by the governor, but it's passed through the process. And so what the policymakers did was they focused primarily on the reliability of the existing infrastructure. So assurance of the supply chain, and that's primarily natural gas. So they've created processes and the mechanics for assuring that natural gas supply is reliable, right? They have created a council of many stakeholders. So it looks like it's quite a large organization. So they've been tasked with communications and enforcement of weatherization and other recommendations. And so this is not a one-time council or entity that's been created. It's going to work over time. It's got a fairly near-term sort of deliverable that it's got to give in terms of recommendations and processes, but that's going to be an ongoing thing. So the way that I would think about what came out of SB3 is supply chain, emergency communications, weatherization, enforcement, and it remains to be seen what exactly that enforcement looks like. I did see in the bill that there's some provision for fines up to $1 million for repeat offenders, whatever that ultimately ends up meaning. And then with respect to the power markets, they are encouraging a detailed evaluation and a look at the ancillary markets. And so that can do a couple of things that can support more renewable development, and it can also support distributed generation, as we talked about. So I would expect distributed resources, distributed generation to really get a leg up through this process.
Richard, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.